Berlin, 1948. The city is a skeleton, a landscape of rubble and ruins. In the western sector, over 2 million people are trapped, facing a starvation engineered by Soviet forces. The blockade has cut them off from the world. Every day is a struggle for a single calorie, a single lump of coal. Amidst this sprawling desperation, a 7-year-old girl named Mercedes Simon sits down to write a letter. With hunger as a constant shadow and the roar of aircraft a daily reminder of their isolation, you would expect her to be writing for help, for food, or about the fear surrounding her. But Mercedes isn't writing about fear. She's not writing about hunger. She's writing to lodge a formal complaint. And her complaint is aimed directly at an American pilot, one of the very men flying the mission to save her city. Her letter wasn't addressed to a general or an official, but to a chocolate uncle. She explained her predicament with the simple logic of a child. Your planes scare our chickens. During the blockade, when eggs were more valuable than gold, those chickens had stopped laying. Her request was specific. Please drop candy by the garden with the white chickens. That pilot, Lieutenant Gail Halverson, would write back, enclosing sticks of gum. But this single letter would ignite something far greater than a simple candy drop. Because 24 years later, in 1972, Mercedes and Halverson met face to face. And that meeting began an incredible friendship that lasted 50 years, until his death in 2022. This is the story of how it happened. To understand the pilot, you first have to understand the world he was flying in. The story begins just weeks earlier, on June 24th, 1948. On that day, Soviet forces slammed an iron ring around West Berlin. All ground access was cut. No trucks, no trains, nothing moved on land into the city. After Germany's defeat, Berlin had been carved up. The Western Allies, America, Britain, and France, controlled the western sectors, while the Soviets controlled the east and all surrounding territory. When the West introduced a new currency, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin responded with a total blockade. The goal was simple and it was brutal. Starve 2 million men, women, and children, until the Western Allies either abandoned the city or gave in to his demands. President Harry Truman refused both options. He would not abandon Berlin, and he would not risk a land confrontation that could ignite World War III. He chose a third, unprecedented path. On June 26, 1948, the Berlin Airlift began. American and British cargo planes would attempt to supply the entire city from the sky. Food, fuel, medicine, coal, everything a population of 2 million needed to survive would be flown in. The task seemed mathematically impossible. The numbers were staggering. To sustain just basic existence, Berlin required approximately 4,500 tons of supplies every single day. In June 1948, at the start of the operation, Allied aircraft managed only 90 tons per day. It wasn't a gap, it was a chasm. The mission, by all logical measures, seemed doomed from the start. This wasn't a simple delivery run. It was a constant, grueling, and dangerous operation. Pilots flew around the clock, navigating crowded air corridors in notoriously bad weather. At its peak, planes were landing at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport every 3 to 4 minutes, 24 hours a day. The operation was massive, chaotic, and utterly unprecedented. The margins for error were zero, and the cost of failure was high. This was not a bloodless logistical exercise. Over the 15-month operation, at least 78 American, British, and German crew members would die in accidents. Among the thousands of pilots risking their lives in this aerial lifeline was one 27-year-old first lieutenant from Utah. His name was Gail Seymour Halverson. Born October 10, 1920, in Salt Lake City, Halverson was the son of sugar beet farmers, growing up in the rugged landscapes of Idaho and Utah during the Great Depression. His family struggled, as many did. Luxuries were almost non-existent, and something as simple as a piece of candy was a special, rare treasure. He'd earned his pilot's license just before Pearl Harbor, served as a transport pilot during the war, and stayed in the newly formed Air Force. In July 1948, he volunteered for the Berlin Airlift, flying a C-54 Skymaster loaded with food and coal into the besieged city. He had no idea his humble upbringing was about to shape a legend. One July afternoon, Halverson had a break between flights. He walked to the end of Tempelhof's runway, where a barbed wire fence separated the bustling airfield from a residential street. On the other side stood about 30 German children, silently watching the planes. Halverson approached them. He'd seen children in other parts of the world, and they almost always begged for gum or candy. He expected the same here, but these children didn't. They didn't beg. They didn't ask for a single thing. That detail struck Halverson profoundly. These children were starving, the children of a recently defeated enemy, yet they stood there with a quiet dignity, simply watching the planes land. They seemed grateful just for the food being flown in, even if it wasn't for them personally. That moment, that silent gratitude, changed everything for him. Gail Halverson reached into his flight suit pocket. All he had were 2 sticks of Wrigley's double mint gum. It was almost nothing, but it was something. He broke the 2 sticks into small pieces and passed them through the barbed wire. The children who received a piece were ecstatic. But it was what happened next that shattered Halverson's resolve. The children who didn't get any gum crowded around the ones who did. They tore off tiny strips of the foil wrapper, not for the gum, but just to smell the faint, sweet scent of mint on the paper. They passed the wrappers around, smelling them like they were treasure. In that instant, these weren't enemy children. They were just children. Children so deprived that the smell of a gum wrapper was a luxury. For Halverson, the son of a sugar beet farmer who knew the value of a rare treat, that moment changed everything. He looked at the children, their faces smelling wrappers, and knew he had to do more. He made them a promise. He told them to come back to the same spot the next day, and he would drop enough candy from his plane for all of them. But a problem immediately surfaced. One of the older children asked the logical question, "How will we know it's your plane? All the planes look the same." Halverson, flying a massive C-54 Skymaster, thought for a second. "I'll wiggle the wings," he said. "When you see me coming, I'll dip the wings back and forth." The next day, Halverson tied chocolate bars to handkerchiefs, creating tiny, makeshift parachutes. As he flew his approach over Tempelhof, he looked down at the tiny crowd of children. He rocked his plane's wings, and the first candy bombs tumbled out. A legend was born. That first drop was meant to be a one-time gesture, but it wasn't. Word spread like wildfire among Berlin's children. Within days, dozens waited by the fence, scanning the sky for the plane that wiggled its wings. Other pilots in Halverson's unit noticed and asked to join, donating their own precious candy rations. Halverson kept the operation secret, fearing a court-martial. He was, after all, dropping unauthorized cargo from a military aircraft. But after 3 weeks, a German newspaper ran a story. The candy bomber was famous. His commanding officer called him in. Halverson expected to be disciplined, his career over. Instead, his commander, General William Tunner, looked at him and said, "You started something. Now we're going to run with it." The operation was officially named Little Vittles, a play on the airlift's code name, Operation Vittles. What started as a secret, unauthorized gesture from one pilot became an official, massive operation. Back in the United States, news of the candy bomber spread. Soon, letters and packages flooded the airbase, sent by American children donating their own candy. Candy companies like Hershey's and Wrigley's donated thousands of pounds by the caseload. By the time the airlift ended in May 1949, pilots had dropped over 23 tons of candy, chocolate, and gum on the children of Berlin. Halverson became a folk hero. The children gave him two names: Uncle Wiggly Wings for his famous signal, and, as Mercedes's letter had already addressed him, the Chocolate Uncle. Among the thousands of children watching those handmade parachutes drift down from the sky, chasing the shadow of the plane that wiggled its wings, was 7-year-old Mercedes Simon. Mercedes and her family lived in Berlin's Friedenau district. Her personal plight was profound. Her father, a Luftwaffe pilot, had gone missing during the war and was likely killed. Her mother struggled daily to support the family in the ruined city. Their single biggest asset, their margin of survival during the ruthless blockade, was a small flock of chickens kept in their garden. Those chickens and their eggs were critical. Mercedes had heard the stories of the generous American pilot. She had seen the handkerchief parachutes near the airport, but none had ever landed near her yard. Knowing the fate of her family hinged on those crucial eggs, she decided she couldn't wait for luck. She had to take action. Mercedes knew she had to appeal directly to the famous pilot. Her letter, now read with the full context of her desperation, was specific. Dear Chocolate Uncle, your planes fly over Friedenau every day. Please drop a parachute over the garden with the white chickens. They've stopped laying. She included her full address. Weeks passed. The noise of the roaring planes continued, but nothing changed in her garden. She might have thought her unusual plea had simply been lost in the bureaucracy of the massive airlift. Then an envelope arrived. Inside, Mercedes found a letter written by Lieutenant Gail Halverson himself. He hadn't just read it. He'd taken the time to write back to one 7-year-old girl. He had also enclosed a stick of chewing gum and a lollipop. For Mercedes, whose city was destroyed and whose father was gone, the gesture meant everything. An American pilot, a stranger, a former enemy, saw her not as a German, but as a child in need of hope. She kept that letter. The Berlin Airlift concluded successfully on May 12, 1949, after 15 months of sustained effort. The Soviets had failed. West Berlin had survived. Lieutenant Halverson soon left Berlin, but he continued his career, eventually earning the rank of colonel in the United States Air Force. He married, and the Halversons raised 5 children. Meanwhile, Mercedes Simon grew up in the surviving city, married Peter Wilde, and built her own life in Berlin. The world changed around them. The Cold War deepened. But for both the pilot and the girl, the memory of that simple letter and the lollipop it delivered never truly faded. Then the clock finally completed its circle. 24 years later, in 1972, Colonel Gail Halverson was promoted and returned to Berlin. His new post? Commander of Tempelhof Central Airport, the very airfield where he had wiggled his wings and dropped candy decades earlier. The stage was set for a remarkable reunion. Word traveled quickly through Berlin. The legendary chocolate pilot was back, now a colonel, and he was running the airport. Mercedes Wilde, née Simon, and her husband Peter were among dozens of Berliners who remembered Halverson and wanted to thank him. They swiftly invited the colonel to their home for dinner. When Halverson arrived, he was greeted warmly, but he had no idea of the emotional ambush that awaited him. As they talked, Mercedes slipped away. She returned carrying something delicate and preserved, something she had kept safe for 24 years. It was the original letter Lieutenant Halverson had written her in 1948. She presented it to him, still nestled in its original envelope, alongside the first candy parachute she'd received. Halverson looked at the envelope, then at the grown woman standing before him. He remembered the 7-year-old girl, the white chickens, the peculiar request. In that moment, as Mercedes later described it, we touched this connection. The letter was no longer just ink on paper. It was a physical bridge between the desperate child of 1948 and the compassionate pilot, fulfilling the promise made by two strangers decades before. That dinner in 1972 was not a simple thank you. It was the start of something profound. It began a 50-year friendship that transcended distance, history, and former political divides. The Halverson family and the Wild family became incredibly close. Colonel Halverson and his wife, Alta, visited Mercedes and her husband, Peter, whenever he returned to Germany. Mercedes traveled across the Atlantic to visit the Halversons in Utah. They spoke on the phone regularly, sharing milestones, attending each other's family events, including birthdays, anniversaries, and graduations. They were, simply put, family. Mercedes herself took on a quiet but important role. She became what she called Germany's friendship ambassador. She appeared with Halverson at countless events, air shows, military ceremonies, and school visits. Whenever the famous chocolate uncle came to Berlin, Mercedes was there, standing beside him, a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness and the possibility of a lifelong connection. Gail Halverson continued to honor his bond with Berlin long after his retirement. He returned for every major airlift anniversary, serving as the living embodiment of German-American friendship. In 2009, for the 60th anniversary, Halverson was 88 years old. Though he moved more slowly, his trademark warmth remained with Mercedes, then 68, always standing faithfully by his side. The reverence for him grew with each passing decade. In 2019, for the 70th anniversary, Halverson returned again at the age of 98. Frail but absolutely determined, he witnessed a baseball field at Tempelhof being renamed Gail S. Halverson Park in his honor. Tens of thousands attended the celebration. When Mercedes brought him onto the stage, he spoke with profound humility. He told the crowd that the true heroes of the Berlin Airlift were not the pilots flying the planes. He insisted, the heroes were the Germans, the parents and children on the ground. They were the stalwarts of the confrontation with the Soviet Union. After the ceremony, Halverson, now 98 and needing assistance to walk, stood at Tempelhof one last time. Just like 1948, he distributed candy directly to children, completing the cycle of kindness that had defined his life. In 2022, at the age of 101, Colonel Gail Halverson died in Provo, Utah. News of his passing spread internationally. The German embassy issued a statement honoring the Berlin's candy bomber. Berlin's mayor noted that Halverson's deeply human act has never been forgotten. Mercedes Wild mourned the loss of the man she had called her chocolate uncle for 74 years. He was the father figure who had sent candy to a frightened child in 1948, the friend who had been part of her life for half a century. Halverson was buried with full military honors. Mercedes, now 81, remains the keeper of their story. She still has the first letter Halverson wrote her, preserving the physical memory of his kindness. She speaks at schools and events about the candy bomber and what his actions meant, not just to her, but to an entire generation of Berlin children who learned that former enemies could become friends. Halverson dropped 23 tons of candy during the airlift, but the true weight of what he gave couldn't be measured in tons. He gave hope. He gave dignity. He showed German children that Americans saw them as children, not as enemies. As Halverson himself once said, "It's not the plane, it's not the candy, it's the spirit of people who just don't give up." That enduring spirit is the legacy preserved by Mercedes Wild. Their friendship proved one simple truth: small acts of kindness can change the world, one child at a time.